and homophobic, transphobic abuse online. It was kind of designed to address contexts of kind of individual workplaces, individual contracts of service.
But when you go on the terms of service for the social media companies, I looked at Facebook's in particular and it says Facebook does not allow hate speech. It might be a surprise to people that use Facebook, but and then when you actually see how do they define hate speech, they largely define it in language very similar to the protected characteristics set out in the equalities legislation. But the issue here seems to be that they don't enforce it and there's no one there to make them do it.
I think that's exactly right. So, I mean, I think one of the key questions here is kind of why doesn't it happen? We know that the voluntary content moderation systems simply do not work for our community. I mean, there are a number of reasons for that. One is often LGBT people, only around half of us will report the abuse we experience online because of a lack of confidence that it will be addressed. When we do report it, it often doesn't meet these very opaque community standards. And I'm sure the committee will all have seen in relation to a number of protected characteristics situations where content we would think absolutely must breach the terms of service is judged as not breaching terms of service or community standards or those kinds of language. So I think this is why kind of having affirmative duties of care is so important, and we absolutely welcome at Stonewall the creation of an affirmative duty of care. And it's also so important that we take a kind of system-wide approach to the way in which these platforms function, rather than seeing it as isolated individual acts of abuse that are then scaled to millions and millions and millions of posts a day.
And just on terms and conditions, at present the bill in respect of legal but harmful content is that the companies must have terms and conditions that deal with the problem, that it's dealt with. If there's a fly in the room, I can kill it, I can let it out, you know, or I could decide to just let it fly around. That's dealt with, right? That wording doesn't work in respect of the bill. It needs to be changed. Similarly, the risk assessments that are there need to meet a minimum standard, otherwise the system will be gamed.
Black.
I'd just like to probe a little the difference between online and offline abuse, because of course we all know that tragically anti-Semitism and the accompanying violence and hate and bullying has deep roots. Similarly, LGBT plus people have long suffered from discrimination, bullying, verbal abuse and goodness knows what else. But it would be good, I mean, I think we probably know the answer to it, but it would be good to hear from you what is the tangible, visceral difference between the offline abuse that these communities, our communities, have suffered over very many years, and the online abuse, which is, of course, novel.
So I guess I would describe the range of ways in which online harms impact LGBTQ plus people as spanning both the purely online and very kind of visceral day-to-day lived impact. So if we think about the kind of abuse our communities suffer, it is, you know, direct insults, it is pylons, it is also forced outing and doxing that identifies people in their day-to-day lives. So as well as the immense kind of mental health harms that are caused by experiencing that, and Rio talked really passionately about that as regards the experience that he has had as a black player, for instance, it's not uncommon for LGBTQ people to experience online abuse that means that they need to move house, or that they are made homeless because they've been outed to a family that's not supportive. It can mean they lose their job, or they feel they need to move jobs. It can mean that they come under threat in their real lives as well. So there are these enormous emotional impacts which can lead us to withdraw from our social life and from our online life, obviously. That can cause deep feelings of kind of isolation and worthlessness, but there are also very much real-world, tangible impacts that relate to where we are able to live and exist safely.
I mean, anti-Semitism online and offline are similarly connected. In extremists, we've seen anti-Semitic murders, Pittsburgh, we've seen, you know, manifestos of terrorists that draw on anti-Semitism. Some of that has been discovered online, some of it's been promoted online, some of it is circulated online. But there's a range of impacts. You know, I work for an organisation, I don't post pictures of my children online very often. right? Because I work in an organisation where I'm alive to the fact that because of what I do and because of the discussion of anti-Semitism and the persecution of Jewish people, that there is a chance someone will try and hurt my children, so I don't post pictures of them online. Right? That's an individual impact. We've not talked much, you have not talked much today about alternative platforms, BitChute, Gab, 4chan, right? These platforms are full of anti-Semitic hate. And on those platforms, there was a video on BitChute about the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust, about my organisation, right? That has impacts on my board. What are they considering about their own safety and what that means, right? So it's a range of factors, but also just for Jews in public life. You had Luciana Berger was in this house and faced an onslaught of anti-Semitic abuse. Well, with a young woman looking at that abuse, what hope do they have of being in public life? Do they really want to face that level of abuse? There are all these impacts. There are many different impacts. The online and the offline interrelate more and more at the moment. And so my view, and for what it's worth talking about these alternative platforms, is they have to be captured in the Category 1 designation, and that risk ought to be a determinant factor in where a platform is placed.
Just to say on that last point, we would completely agree with that. It's really clear that there are a number of smaller platforms that have a very significant role to play in not only platforming hate against LGBTQ plus people, but encouraging the dissemination of misinformation about our communities that would not currently be captured in exactly the same way as is the case for Jewish communities.
Thank you. That's a really useful suggestion. I just have one follow-up. You'll have heard from some of the previous evidence about the difficulty of gathering data and getting data out of the platforms. It's always promised but never comes. And I was just wondering, have you tried to get data out of the platforms about the scale of anti-Semitic abuse or homophobic and transphobic abuse? And B, whether you are able to gather some of that and capture some of that data?
So, we work quite closely with the platforms. We don't have any better data than is available publicly. In terms of LGBTQ abuse online, there is a real absence of kind of high quality studies, but there are studies that do exist that give us a sense of the scale and the impact. So internationally, in kind of more progressive countries, we know, for instance, that around 3/4 of LGBTQ people will have personally experienced online hate that's directed towards them, and all of us will have witnessed it. So there are some studies that are available there. I anticipate that we will pick this up later, but I think that anonymity is a very different issue for LGBTQ people than it is perhaps for broader populations. So I won't speak to it in this question. It's also probably worth saying that the data that does exist, for instance, is quite good data from the Fundamental Rights Agency in the EU, shows that the prevalence of online hate against LGBTQ people is rising quite rapidly. So they looked at the difference between, I think, 2015 and 2020, so a 5-year cycle, and saw almost a 10% increase in the percentage of LGBTQ people who were reporting incidences of online abuse and hate being directed against them.
There is certainly some data out there. The EU again has a blind shopper model they operate, looking at what content is taken out. So it relates to illegal hate speech. They found that, for example, on YouTube, I think this was 2019, 80% of the illegal material had been taken down. Right, so it gives you a feel for the journey to go. I have tried for about 10 years to get one of the largest social media companies to give me the PowerPoint that they use to train their moderators. And they keep on promising it, and I never get it. And it makes me think, well, who are they talking to who is informing these moderator guidelines and these PowerPoints? If there's no independent review, Imran was talking about having independent review real independent review of what's going on. Well, how do we quality assess, the moderation? And in terms of other data, we've got plenty, but we released a report with the Wolf Institute and CST earlier this week about Instagram. We know that there's anti-Semitic supply rather than demand. We know there's 170,000 anti-Semitic Google searches each year. 10% of those have violent language associated with them, for example.
So you'd back an amendment which gave the regulator power to go into the platforms and audit them and demand data?
we definitely would subject to kind of concerns about user anonymity, but to be able to understand the scale, the pattern, the network, a lot of the abuse itself is not from real humans, it's bot farms, those sorts of things. So having a better understanding of the pattern of abuse globally and the way in which it transmits and the way in which abusive stories kind of transmogrify as they travel around the internet will be enormously helpful, and we do think that the regulator should be able to require that data.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Jim Knight.
Thanks. My first question is around the use of encrypted messaging services like WhatsApp and Telegram and so on. How much are they a problem around the dissemination of hate and harm? And is there a relationship then between people using open platforms to capture audiences, to engage them with relatively benign content and then transfer them over into private groups on those platforms? And is there anything that we can do through a bill like this to delve into that?
So, building on what I just said about how there's very little evidence about, systematic evidence about the experience of LGBTQ abusers online and how they work and how they network, I'm not aware of anything that would give us definitive information that would be confident talking about in terms of encrypted messaging services that you're pointing to. I think there is a huge need for more research and more data to be available in this area.
There's definitely a need for more research. Certainly, there's a question to what extent all of these services are entirely private. I mean, you will have probably read about WhatsApp and the fact that messages can be reported and then reviewed. There was, I believe, a private members bill at one point looking at private groups on Facebook and whether the owners of those groups ought to have some kind of responsibility over a certain size. So that's something that you might wish to review. But certainly, yes, I think that the encrypted messaging should be a concern addressed in the bill.
Thank you. And then one other question, I think particularly to you, Danny, in that your evidence talked about countervailing duties and that protecting democratically important and journalistic content was important, but potentially a loophole. How could we close that sensibly in the bill?
I think it needs further definition. In short, and it needs responsible boundaries. You know, I could call myself a journalist. I mean, I do write about wrestling and other things, but you know, I could call myself a journalist, and all of a sudden, I've got additional protections under the bill around my content. The example I think we gave is around, you know, someone, a candidate opposing another candidate from the Women's Equality Party, right, and using misogynist abuse, and then say, well, this is democratically important given the platform they're on. Well, hold on, you know, okay, yes, the Equalities Act may come to bear, but hold on, well, is that democratically important or is that abuse? So I think further definition, trying to explore what that means, and putting some of the meat on the bones of that would be helpful.
If I may, we would absolutely agree that both of those exemptions need further definition. And just to give an example, in support of that, one of the things that Stonewall was founded to do was to create LGBTQ inclusive schools. And it is incredibly important that people are able to express a wide range of views about, for instance, inclusive relationships and sex education, and indeed we welcome and support that. It's an almost inevitable consequence of that getting talked about publicly and in online platforms that very, very quickly individuals and organisations become subject to very harmful, traditionally homophobic tropes, i.e. we get accused of being dangerous to children or enablers of paedophilia. We should be able to have a kind of free and open debate about inclusive relationships and sex education in schools without exposing LGBTQ people and LGBTQ organisations to that sort of straightforwardly abusive content. So it's really important that when we're thinking about kind of those democratic policy debates, that we don't create a loophole so wide that anything can be said in that context.
Thank you. Thank you. Dean Russell.
Thank you, Chair. Just a broad question. I'd like to go into a few details in a moment as well, but is there a bit of chicken and egg with social media? Has social media, from the descriptions we've had today from previous panellists, it sounds like social media is becoming this platform which effectively is creating more hate, more racism, more prejudice, more homophobia, all of these things. is that because society is moving in that direction anyway, or is it social media, in your view, that's caused that, and therefore this bill will help reduce it? If I may come to you first, Danny.
It facilitates the spread. We know that there's an increase generally in hate, right? CSC, the Community Security Trust, which monitors and collects the incidents and reports on the incidents of anti-Semitism, has seen a steady upwards trajectory in respect of anti-Semitism, and there are particular events that spur that anti-Semitism on. But another piece of research done by the Institute for Jewish Policy Research found that whilst maybe 2.4 to 4% of the population might be considered anti-Semites, up to 30% of the population could consider one statement, anti-Semitic statement, to be true. So 30% of people might believe something anti-Semitic. If you then put that on, layer that onto social media, look at how that spreads, right? Because I can put my anti-Semitic idea onto social media, it stays there, other people see it, and then it links. This report that we did on Instagram talks about chaotic trolling. People put various hashtags, and they're used as gateways into conspiracy and into anti-Semitism. So it is a bit of both, right? We know that things are worse, but the social media facilitates that spread and the spread of that hatred.
If I may come to you, Nancy.
I think it's probably quite important as regards LGBTQ people to think differently about what general public attitudes are and the direction that they're taking, which is overwhelmingly positive. So if we think about the general population, attitudes to certainly lesbian and gay people are some of the fastest changing positive social attitudes we have over the last 50 years. And to not kind of confuse what happens in the online space with too much of a fear that actually public opinion around LGBTQ people is negative, is moving in the wrong direction. We actually don't have any evidence of that. In fact, the contrary. I think what that points to, though, is this kind of this farming of abuse, that you have a minority of the community who are enabled through the way in which these platforms function to engage in this kind of abuse and to proliferate, and platforms reward proliferating abuse. You know, the click-through is king. And also, just to pick up points that I know Danny's alluded to and people in the previous session alluded to, I think it's really important to understand that in this online abuse space, there are really close interconnections between abuse of one group and abuse of other groups. So we shouldn't think of this as necessarily somebody is going online because they're motivated, because they are a racist. There are very, very many people online who are engaged in kind of wholesale trolling of multiple marginalised communities, and indeed having prejudiced views about one marginalised community and expressing that online can lead, through the kinds of processes Danny's been pointing to people becoming essentially radicalised into having prejudiced views against a number of our communities. So I think we should feel confident about where the general public is at. I'm very worried about the systematic online space.
Yeah, part of the reason why I say that chicken and egg is whether... I would say I've been involved in digital for many years, probably not nowhere near the experience, no doubt, around the table. But I remember when social media started, it was trying to encourage people to go online. And then now society primarily, you know, it's one of the main methods of communication with friends and so on. And I just wonder whether was a reflection of racism and homophobia and prejudice and all these things in social media 10 years ago different from what it is now? Was it back then a few people would be saying things which did reflect what was going on in society, whereas it's now being used as a recruitment driver to encourage more people to be homophobic and racist and prejudiced and hate-filled? Is there a risk that actually if we don't stem this with this bill now, then actually in 5-10 years' time we actually will see this much more in the reality of society and not just online? If I may come to you first, Nancy. On that.
I would say maybe yes in two ways. So we should worry about, as Danny's pointed to, online hate spilling over into real-world hate crimes. And we know, for instance, I pointed to the fact that the prevalence of online hate as regards LGBTQ people is heading up from a high base. We know that reported hate crime in the UK is also heading up very rapidly. And much of that is very likely to be improved reporting and improved recording. But when we are suffering a kind of wave of very serious violent attacks, primarily against gay men in our cities, and indeed the homophobic murder of a gay man in Tower Hamlets near where I live just a few weeks ago, I don't think we should be sort of sanguine about at the extreme ends of this. Normalisation of hateful attitudes or hateful attitudes that spill over into real life. I think there is also a really important connection here to be made with radicalisation generally. So there's a really good report that came out this year from King's College, the International Centre for Radicalisation Studies, that pointed to, during the first 100 days of the Biden administration, the far right using transphobia, which is a very, very prevalent form of abuse against our community, as a recruiting tool into a range of beliefs that include very entrenched anti-Semitism, very entrenched racism, very complex...
If I may ask you just on that point then, sorry, and I'll come to you in a moment. Are you saying that actually what's happening at the moment is that it's certain types of content's being used almost as a gateway drug to a hate, in the sense that actually, so hashtags are on things that people might generally go, well, actually, I'm a bit, not think of it as being prejudiced, but of the one of the 30 comments, and that's then getting people down the Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole and going deeper and deeper into more conspiracy theories?
Yes, for a minority of social media users, it's one of the areas where there is good research because of all of the data around radicalisation and far-right studies. For the minority of users, there is a kind of rabbit hole effect where prejudice against one group could be anti-Semitism, it could be homophobia, it could be anti-black racism, as we were hearing about earlier, brings people into contact with a wide range of deliberately radicalising content against other groups. I think the previous speaker called it the four horsemen of the apocalypse, but that is how it is, that these very prevalent forms of abuse online then become gateways to other beliefs.
And Danny, for me...
if it's a recruitment tool, I think it's working. I mean, 5 years ago, the incident levels of anti-Semitism online were about the 18% mark. They're now up to about the 40% mark of the incidents that are reported. We did some work with Media Matters, a US NGO, which investigated 4chan, this alternative platform, and looked at the rising nature of anti-Semitism on that platform, and it rose from hundreds of thousands of posts in 2015 to something like 1.7 million in 2017. And actually they looked at the intersecting abuse, misogyny and anti-Semitism, and that increased about 180%. And so when it comes to the bill, I should say that it's important that intersectionality be considered, so people with multiple distinct and overlapping identities. But that shows you that it is, I think, being used as a gateway. We know from the QAnon movement, we know that there are people who start in the gaming and can be drawn from those comments boards into online spaces. The video, as I said, of the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust, there was a trailer for it on YouTube, right? People tried to get people off YouTube onto the BitChute, and from BitChute, presumably onto other platforms too. So there are those gateways.
And just very briefly, if I may, just building on that, we've heard evidence today, actually, especially in the first session, about this interconnection of this sort of, cross-pollinating hatred in different groups, in a way, across different channels and so on, and often from a small group of the same people with multiple anonymous identities. Are you finding that actually where do you see the anonymity as part of this bill? I mean, do you think there's enough to tackle that? And also, do you see that that's one of the challenges here, that you might have one person with 20 identities spreading hate to millions of people?
It's an issue that isn't really addressed in the bill properly. I mean, anonymity certainly was in the white paper, that there would be address for anonymity. There's nothing at the moment. I mean, people in this house, Siobhan Bailey, Margaret Hodge, have called for verification systems so that one can engage only with verified accounts. we'd actually go further and say make it the platform's problem. They should be liable where they can't provide the details of an individual, where there's a burden of proof and there's sufficient evidence and a limited revelation of that data. You should be able to find out, as you can in financial services, the know your customer principle, who's responsible. That said, I know that there are important there must be important protections for those that are victims of domestic abuse, whistleblowers, those who would like to come out but are frightened to give their details, or who have parents who may be concerned about that for whatever reason. There will be various reasons why anonymity is precious, and perhaps middleware or perhaps trusted partners who can be middle people with that data might be a solution.
Just to say a couple of things, but mostly I'll talk a bit about anonymity, because I suspect it's one of the areas where Stonewall's perspective differs, particularly from an international protection perspective. I think it's possible to regulate a lot of the behaviours you're describing without knowing the individual identity of the account, is the first thing that I would say. So accounts that are behaving in a particular way can be identified without knowing who the account owner is. And I think it's really important, if you like, to separate the question of can we regulate and can we identify and remove accounts that behave in a way that is abusive, whether it's through that kind of networking, whether it's through the use of bots. The answer is we can. Those platforms can identify those accounts without knowing who owns them, and they can delete them. They don't, but they can. I think in terms of anonymity, whilst acknowledging and really understanding all of the reasons why many groups will have a deep desire, I guess, to have some degree of lifting of that veil, I would just like to really emphasise to the committee our deep concerns, particularly for LGBTQ people around the world, in terms of personally identifiable information. So in the case of, I know people have suggested things like names being visible, even in progressive countries that are accepting, we know that will expose LGBTQ people to harm. Outing and doxing is one of the ways in which our community in the UK is already harmed. So making it easier to identify an LGBTQ end user, even in very liberal, accepting environments, increases danger to our community. If we look at that in the global context, we know from research that Article 19 has done that almost 90% of LGBTQ users in Egypt and Lebanon and Iran said that they are incredibly frightened of even mentioning what their name is, even in any kind of private messaging online. And we know that a very substantial amount of the men that have been charged in Egypt, over 50% of men that have been charged in Egypt in recent years with homosexual offences, because it's indeed illegal to be gay there, as it still is in 71 countries around the world, were the subject of online stings. So I think it is incredibly important to understand of the potential impact of these global companies introducing identity verification that is visible in any way to end users. In terms of kind of middle options and middleware options, or kind of know your customer type things, obviously that doesn't expose to end users, but we do think it would have a very considerable chilling effect on people's participation, particularly in regressive countries. So in countries where there will be concern about who is working, about basically data security and who is working in those platforms in those countries, or in countries where the government has the right to request data from countries, personal data from companies about LGBTQ people. There aren't many, but there are some. LGBTQ people will be extremely reluctant to participate online. And so I think there is a risk of a chilling effect, and I would just really entreat the committee to be very thoughtful about those impacts. I recognise that I'm not coming with a solution, but just kind of presenting you with a difficult problem, and we would be really, really happy to kind of work those through, including with our international partners.
Thank you. Darren Jones.
Thank you. Well, that was my first question, so you've answered it for me, so thank you. My second question was, I think, slightly less difficult, which is this issue of capacity for enforcement. Now, we're obviously primarily looking at rules, But as we said right at the very beginning, there are already rules in place that aren't being enforced. Because I think, as you said, Danny, the police are stretched. I don't know if you have a view based on the amount of content or victims that you deal with, what you would want to see the government fund Ofcom to have in terms of capacity. Do you think this is a big regulator? Has anyone taken any views on how many head count it might be or what types of specialisms it might be? Or do you think it's actually just to define the rules and then let the government and Ofcom figure that out? Because the fear, I suppose, is that we get some good rules, but then we don't have the capacity to enforce it because we're stretched because there's so much stuff to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think, look, firstly, Ofcom, as I understand it, under the current rules, can still co-designate, and I think that it should. I think the BBFC is a very reputable organisation. I like them. I think they understand anti-Semitism. Similarly, the Extremism Commission, so there are people there that can do some of the lifting. I haven't got specific numbers on how many people it would take, but based on the way in which Ofcom has approached regulating television programmes and radio in respect of anti-Semitism, I have confidence that it would be able to do the same. And again, if we look at systems issues rather than content, it will go back to those systems. If a general duty is introduced, it will have to go back to the systems. Super complaints can be brought by organisations, hopefully like ours or the CST or Stonewall, and we would say, hold on, there's a systems issue here, deal with that and give the regulator that overview on a kind of wider scale, and then it will be able to see what the kind of the impact downstream, I suppose.
I'm not a specialist, so I'll confine myself to a fairly narrow comment, which is I think it's much more about capability than it is about headcount. So it strikes me, even from the conversations we have at Stonewall with tech providers, that you are very quickly in quite complicated conversations about machine learning and NLP approaches and these sorts of things that I can just about hold on to because I've done a little bit of data science, but most people, and indeed I can only hold on to it as far as what I just said. I think assuming that Ofcom has the capability in terms of the technical understanding to effectively regulate an industry that innovates at an extraordinary pace, that is highly technical, is the key thing, because they will be faced by providers who will be saying this is simply not possible, or with lots of complicated documents proving how it's not possible. Being able to interrogate that answer, being able to regulate effectively, requires them to understand at quite a deep technical level what it is possible to do in those platforms. So I would be more concerned about capability than kind of capacity, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you. John Nicholson.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask how seriously, this is a question for you, Nancy, how seriously do the platforms take it when you approach them with examples of hate?
So, I mean, we work really closely with a number of the platforms that would indeed be regulated by this bill and have extremely productive, positive relationships with them. So when we...
Like whom?
I'm going to name just one, but we work very closely, for instance, with TikTok. And when we speak to them at a generalised level, I think that the reception is extremely warm. The same will be true of platforms like Twitter and platforms like Facebook. And I think previous witnesses have said the same thing to you. When you talk about discriminatory abuse to online platforms, they respond very warmly, very positively, very affirmatively, and very openly at a generalised level. And
they talk the talk.
They talk the talk, and in fairness,
tick the talk.
Yeah, they tick the talk, and in my view, it is genuinely meant. So I don't think it's disingenuous. I think there is a genuine concern about the hate that all of these platforms enable. What we don't see is that feeding down into that self-regulatory space. So we don't see, huge strides forward in the quality of content moderation, which is what's needed. Huge strides forward in the content of quality of content moderation. So there is a kind of disjunction between what is done at the day-to-day level and experienced particularly by day-to-day users. I mean, we can talk about users who have a very high profile because they're in the public eye, but actually enormous numbers of just ordinary LGBTQ people get abused online and are trying to report that abuse. What we don't see is those users being able to access kind of effective protection and redress.
As a gay man, I was called a greasy bender on Twitter. Now, I would argue that's unpleasant. I think most people would accept that crosses a line, doesn't it? Well, here's what Twitter said. Twitter wrote back and said it doesn't breach any of their community standards. Mm-hmm. So I then copied and pasted their community standards and what it says about abuse of hate targeted at LGBT people. And they wrote back saying, well, thank you for your communication. It does not breach our community standards. I provided the voice just because that's what I assume it would have...
Love that you've got a content moderator voice in your head, John.
It would have been. This went backwards and forwards 3 or 4 times. I even tweeted the absurdity of it and copied them in. Absolutely nothing happens. Now, they know that I'm a member of Parliament, and they know that I sit on the Select Committee. They know I'm on this committee, and although this predated that, and if they're prepared to behave with such utter disdain towards somebody who's got a wee bit of influence, can you imagine the disdain they treat the average LGBT person with?
We don't have to imagine it. We can see it, right? So you will often see on online platforms attempts by wider community members to protect somebody. So not only that person will have reported the abuse, but other people will have reported the abuse, and they will all get the same message back.
Annie, I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, on both points actually. So one, we've got a case, there's a member of the House of Lords who every time they tweet on Jewish-related issues gets a fake picture tweeted back at them relating to their supposed illegal sexual conduct, taken it up with Twitter, and every time it hasn't broken our terms. And that's it, right? It's completely within their decision-making process. Now, I think they would suggest that because a public figure is different, that somehow it's acceptable that this fake abuse is tweeted. I disagree. In terms of the companies, we similarly have very good, constructive discussions, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter. I've had less constructive or certainly difficult conversations with Microsoft. And the bill at present exempts search from Category 1. The search companies are having a laugh at the bill's expense if they are not included in Category 1. Google was directing people to the search, "Are Jews evil?" Microsoft Bing was directing people to "Jews are," and then a rude word about Jews. Currently, if you were to search the word goyim on Google, right, it's a Yiddish originally word for non-Jews, which has been used in a pejorative sense now. If you search for it on Microsoft Bing, you will get an anti-Semitic website as the top search result and a banned Twitter account or a suspended Twitter account. The search companies, Alexa, Siri, they are completely outside of the bounds of responsibility of this bill, which it will be a travesty if they are left out of Category 1, and they should absolutely be in there.
Yeah, I agree. I just don't think they take it seriously. They're just waiting until somebody forces them because they won't self-regulate. You mentioned, Nancy, the big rise in anti-LGBT abuse. What percentage of that do you think is transphobic abuse? Because I've noticed, as a non-trans person, I've just noticed this explosion in transphobia, and on a personal basis, when I got a lot of transphobic abuse directed at me after simply posting a link to a wee film about a constituent who was trans that she'd made with the BBC, and after that, it was just this tsunami of vileness.
Yeah, so there isn't good enough data to give you a number. I wish that the research was there so I could give you a number, but it is undoubtedly the case that the prevalence of online transphobia, directed particularly but not exclusively towards trans women or featuring trans women, is extremely high, is rising extremely quickly, there we go. And is directed not only at trans people, but to anybody that supports them. Similarly, I have to lock everything down, otherwise my social media accounts are a complete mess constantly for the obvious reason because of the job that I do. But you can see things like if a company or if a public figure makes even the most anodyne positive comment about trans people, like, you know, I think we've seen Nigella experience this recently, the Women's Institute, I mean, really kind of just mainstream figures and organisations saying very straightforward things like, you know, this is a nice woman who is part of the Women's Institute who happens to be a trans woman. You will see days and days of transphobic dogpiling on that account, whoever it is. And if it weren't for the fact that it is such a distressing experience, I would invite you all to experiment with it. I really would not advise you to do it because it's horrible to experience that kind of a dogpile. But it is automatic and instantaneous, and we see that happening all around the world. And it then becomes, as we've said, a gateway into other things. So if you follow some of those threads of transphobic abuse, you are very quickly into people also saying homophobic things, and you are very quickly into people also saying racist or anti-Semitic. You don't have to kind of follow the thread very far for it to become a complete kind of mess.
You've been targeted very specifically as an organisation by a very sinister new group called the LGBT Alliance, who appear to exist just to stir up transphobic hatred. They claim to be a charity. Bizarrely, they've been given charitable status, though they appear to do no charitable work of any kind. They just raise money, put out big adverts, and target gay people with transphobic abuse. Most of it's conducted online. To what extent do you think they're succeeding? Because they target you, and I noticed that you're getting pushed out of all sorts of organisations at the moment, including Ofcom, as a result of LGBT Alliance pressure. Ofcom, in fact, the chief executive switched because at one point she gave evidence to the other select committee saying that she thought that the LGBT Alliance should not be allowed a voice to express hostile anti-trans views. And then she flipped and then said that she did think that they should be allowed a voice after a meeting that she had with them. What role are they what role are they playing?
It's not going to surprise you, John, but I'm going to give you a bit of a politician's answer if that isn't a rude way of framing it. So I'm not the chief executive of the Charity Commission, so I'm not going to make any kind of comment on who isn't covered by the regulator. I guess what I think probably is helpful for the purposes of this discussion is to think about the way that the global anti-gender movement, which is a movement that attacks not only LGBT people but women's reproductive rights globally, is associated with a process called NGOization and is strongly associated with kind of the creation of online groups. And that is something that you can see well beyond the bounds of the UK. So I think that thinking about the way in which organisations that exist primarily online are capable of becoming nexuses of kind of targeting individuals and targeting organisations is a really important part of this picture. Organisations that are kind of primarily digital. Of course, it was also really important to protect people's rights to free association, free speech, those sorts of things, which is why you're going to get a very politic answer from me. For those of you that are concerned about Stonewall, we're doing fantastically well, and the Diversity Champions programme is in fact growing. So please don't be too worried about us.
Politician's answer indeed.
Eben Kidron, thank you.
Thank you. Actually, Danny, I want to go back to something you said earlier. You said in the full government response there was a duty to care about...
General duty.
A general duty to care about reasonably foreseeable. And I just want to interrogate, we've already touched on whether the safety objectives are good, excellent, need some work. But what is your analysis about what's missed by having specific duties? And if you were to go back to the full government response and have a general duty to care, do you really need the other ones that sit underneath it currently?
Well, arguably, potentially not. My view is that you end up more in a content space than a systems space, right? If you start going down that line, and that's a space that I think it's convenient for some people to be in, because I think you get into discussion of free speech when I don't think one needs to. I think it potentially ties Ofcom into the way in which it can respond, and I think it makes the bill more complicated. So I think you could potentially make the bill easier to read, give Ofcom better freedom, and essentially make the bill make better sense.
And can you actually extrapolate? I mean, this is a terribly important point, because if we need the general duty, why does having these specific duties push us into the content space? And I might actually add a little question there, because you'll notice that the bill in the same journey became a harmful content bill, not harmful content and activity. So there's two moves in that direction. So I'm just interested to hear what you say.
Because you begin to define what, or to have to attempt to define what legal but harmful content is. Now, look, Ofcom does already do that to an extent, right? When it makes determinations about, I can't remember the exact wording, but certainly the Communications Act and its authority to determine what societal standards are. But you get into defining what is legal but harmful, what is illegal versus what is legal. And so you strip all of that out. It's about what did they do to address the reason. We know, right? Take Wiley, the grime rapper on Twitter, right? He goes on an anti-Semitic rant over 48 hours or so. You've got a tweet every 87 seconds. It's seen by conservatively 46 million people, something like that, right? The issue there is the content, right? And we can discuss, well, was it legal but harmful? Was it illegal? With one of the tweets said may have been illegal. Hold on. The company has a duty to address reasonably foreseeable harms. It is a reasonably foreseeable harm that an account with a lot of followers repeatedly violating community standards might need some kind of graded response. That is I think, given what we know about social media to date and the codes that will be out there, that's a reasonable foreseeable harm. And there will be, as I say, tort law and other things to look to. But that turns it into a systems question. That is not about whether the content was legal but harmful and did the terms and conditions deal with it. Right? It's not about was one piece illegal and did they deal with that one piece of content. It's about did they have a system, more broadly, to address accounts with large followers that break their terms or go on anti-Semitic rants. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and it sort of connects to something else you said about minimum standards. So if you're saying we need a systems approach and a duty to care, and we have these objectives, we know what we're working towards, can you rely on their community rules and terms, or do you then have to have minimum standards so that, because I could, on the map we're mapping, I could say anything goes and it's fine on my site to be anti-Semitic in my terms.
Yeah, but I mean, so you compare YouTube and BitChute. BitChute has very minimum, that I do think there should be minimum standards. And we, Carnegie Trust, who are fabulous, have produced a code of practice around hate crime, which we helped with, right? There are ways in which the regulator could publish codes of practice which could inform those terms of service or help with those minimum standards. I don't think that's a very difficult task. We'd help with it, and I'd rather do it once or twice with Ofcom than having every time there's a new platform to go to them and help them with their terms and conditions. It would make the draw on our organisation a lot less, and I'm sure the same for Stonewall and others.
And do you believe that would be a chilling of speech, to have minimum standards and a duty to care? Does that chill free speech?
I mean, Hope Not Hate, we just put into a report that Hope Not Hate did on legal but harmful content and freedom of expression. And Imran was saying earlier, at the moment there isn't freedom of expression for some groups. Mm-hmm. Groups are marginalised, are taken out of this conversation. Right? And as I say, in other areas, we do regulate legal but harmful content. The BBFC, I mentioned them before, they refused to classify a film called Hate Crime, which was a gang beating up a Jewish family for 90 minutes or so. Right? Now that content can still be found, but it can't legally be bought. You know, they limited its reach. Similarly, you know, this stuff will exist online. There will be websites that you can find this stuff on. People will still be able to be horrible, but actually we're saying no, there is a minimum standard that we expect within the law, and then one that Parliament sets, not Mark Zuckerberg waking up and deciding one day that Holocaust denial isn't all right on his platform.
Right, so just finally, are you trying to guide the committee towards the mechanisms of spread rather than the mechanisms of takedown?
Yeah, I think both are important, but yes, the systems is where I would focus, because the systems have widest application and effect in respect of the content downstream.
Thank you.
Thank you. And final questions now from Susan Webb.
Yeah, it's just a quick one really. Do you think the online platforms understand the scale of the work they actually need to do once this bill comes in place, and exactly what they also need to do thereafter? So they've got to get themselves prepared, and then they've got to do the work after.
I think they know the scale of the problem, and they probably know the scale of the problem better than anybody sitting in this room. Whether they know the scale of the work required for them to address the problem, I'm not sure.
I think they're having a bit of an internal debate about it, is the truth. I think some are probably within the company understand and know what's coming. And there are so many parts. You know, I haven't talked about supply chains. You know, for example, could the bill explicitly reference supply chains and ensure that, you know, whether it be provision of gifts or some other companies that are working to supply the different products, when you look at a Facebook or a Twitter, should that be referenced? Should we, you know, have reference to the Bribery Act or the UN principles or OECD principles and what have you? I think that they are going to, in some cases, get a bit of a shock, and I think that's brilliant. You know, I do think, and I hope I haven't given any other impression, it's a great piece of legislation in terms of trying to set a new standard for the world. You know, that's to be welcome. And so, look, I don't know if this is our final opportunity to say something, but if it is, I wanted to say that it's just been the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, and the traditional greeting is Shana Tova Mutukah, maybe a good and a sweet year. So I hope for the committee it is a good and a sweet year and that your deliberations are good. I've also brought you all honey cake, individually wrapped, so you can enjoy that at the end, the traditional Rosh Hashanah food.
Well, we greatly appreciate that. If I may just ask one question to Nancy Kelley. I just want to go back to this quite important issue around anonymity. I take what you say about not breaching anonymity for end users, but the question about what sort of data a platform might hold. We have to think about the legislation in terms of the UK-only context. Do you think it is possible to have a system where a court order could be obtained to ask for information about an account that a law enforcement agency believes that account has committed offences and it wants to understand who the operator of the account is so that they could be charged with an offence? Do you think it is possible to create a system where that could happen while still protecting the public identity of the account involved?
It's clearly possible, but it seems that it's probably quite complicated. So I think probably the devil is in the detail, and that is how it applies here. I think our concern is that these are not one nation companies, right? These are global companies, and when we're imposing kind of general duties of care, which we are entirely in support of, one of the kind of easy wins is around a form of identity verification that they would just use across a platform, which then affects people well beyond the scope of users in this country. But it is clearly feasible to construct something that mitigates the risk in this domestic context.
Okay. Thank you very much. That concludes our evidence.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Committee Room 16, sound. 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 Committee Room 16.